It's Wednesday, December 4th. I'm Adam Walsh, and this is The Signal. There's a course at Memorial University called Homelessness and Social Control. Today, we are taking a deep dive into this course. I've got a professor and 3 undergrads here to talk about it and how it applies to this province and all of us. So for this show, where you come into it, the listener, my question for you, and this is just, it's for the text line today or emails. What do you think about, or what do you think we need to do, what do you think we need to do to end homelessness? Or at a minimum, improve things? The text line is open, 709-327-8206. Emails thesignal@cbc.ca. We've done a few of these housing and homelessness type shows. Obviously, it's an important issue of this time. And I like this idea, right? Today on the show, we're going to dive into a university course, right? We're going to go through that, a couple of points in the syllabus. Talk to students about why they got into the course, right? Why was it interesting as an undergrad to say, no, I want to do this one, what they learned, and then to localize it, to have a discussion around what some of this can mean or does mean for the real world of housing and homelessness, and that term social control, which I was learning about planning the show. Professor Daniel Kudla is here, sociology prof. How you doing?
Good. Thanks for having us on the show.
Thanks for coming in. So before we get to the great students who are here, and they are great students, because we're talking in the lead up to this, and they got lots to say for this show. Tell us about the course and how it started.
Yeah, so I started this course back in 2019, or 3 years ago, I should say, shortly after I started in 2019 in the sociology department, just trying to expand some of our course offerings for sociology and criminology students. And with homelessness rising over the years since the pandemic, there's been a huge uptake in student interest in the course. So I was happy to see that. And then I have 3 great students here to help me talk about some of these issues. The essence of the course is really to examine the way homeless populations have been governed and managed by different organizations and institutions. If you think about the experience of homelessness, it entails being subject to the control and care of others. So that's the essence of the course. And we examined a range of different topics from policing, the homeless shelter, homeless encampments, the housing first approach. And we do so through a sociological perspective, criminological perspective, and a little bit of urban geography, because there's certainly a spatial aspect to visible homelessness on the streets.
When students take this course, right, but at the end of it, what do they yes, they're learning about the subject, but what do they get from this type of a thing for studying the course? What are some of the end results that you see for development of students for doing this?
Yeah, that's a great question. My hope, and I did my spiel last week when we finished up the class, is just to have a different lens on looking on homelessness. This is a second-year course, so a lot of students might not have a lot of experience or thoughts about what homelessness entails, what social control is. So my hope is always to broaden their perspective to have kind of a sense of what has led to homelessness, what are the common approaches and logics to it. So it's just about shifting their perspective, the personal perspective is my hope.
Okay. Well, what I'll do, I'll get the students to introduce themselves, and when we'll go a whip around and just tell folks what you're studying and what your interests are, and then we'll kind of get into more. Sarah, welcome back to the show.
Hey, how's it going?
Good. So tell folks who you are and a little bit about yourself.
So my name is Sarah Rochford. Technically, I'm now officially a graduate of the criminology course. Well, provided that everything goes to plan.
Congratulations.
It will be that I'm done all my degree requirements now, so I now have a Bachelor of Arts with a major in crim.
Excellent.
So that's always great. This is my second time here. I was here back in February as well, talking about how policing is changing.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm glad to be back.
And when you saw this course, obviously, people listening, okay, this makes sense for you to want to do the course, but for your personal interest, how did it kind of push you towards it for thinking about, that might be interesting?
So technically, I took this as an elective. I took a crim course as an elective, even though I'd already done a million crim courses beforehand. So I think that is a testament to, the fact that I enjoy courses in this sort of field. But mostly I thought that it was going to be interesting to take some of these concepts and apply them to other things that I have learned, which I feel like I have, because, some of what we talked about is very applicable to other areas of, social sciences and that kind of thing.
Cool. Eric, what about yourself?
Yeah, thank you for having me, Adam. I'm a second-year psychology student, actually, so I guess kind of the black sheep here. But I found, at least in my involvement with psychology, in our lab, volunteering, and the like, that we really look, I would say, predominantly towards kind of quantitative measurements and data analyses. And I figured sociology would be really a good way to expand my horizons into some more qualitative measures, like some of the interviews and the ethnographies that made up some of the publications we looked at. And as well, I'm just I find myself personally interested in politics and the way that power is kind of rationed and wielded, as well as the ways that social control are enacted. Mm. Yeah. So I found this a really interesting and engaging way to kind of venture into that.
Yeah, so on the qualitative side of it, as things started, when did you start to be like, oh, this is, like hearing from folks and opinions and different perspectives? Like, when did it kind of hit you that, like, this is something that you had the thought going into it, but when did it, did that thought get confirmed that, oh, I'm kind of into this?
Yeah. I think, really most interesting for me in terms of the methodology have been the ethnographies and kind of the long-term immersive kind of ways of studying homelessness. Yeah. Yeah. And, I think that that's for me been really kind of a really interesting standard for qualitative study where, I guess I would imagine in academia there's kind of a focus more towards the empiricism behind quantitative measures. Mm.
And when you say an ethnography, give us an example of something that you studied.
Yeah. So I can't remember the author now, but there was the...
it's broad strokes.
Yes. Yeah.
no tests here.
There was the sort of San Francisco, or it was Fresno. There were encampments that one of the authors conducted an ethnography within, and did several kind of qualitative interviews with not only the encampment residents, but local, municipal officials in trying to, I guess, kind of get both sides of the story of how they view that encampment.
And what do you think it's so important to get that stuff?
Yeah, absolutely. I think really it boils down to we are going to see just by their their proximity to power a lot more of the perspectives of officials and of people representing the kind of controlling aspects of encampments, but I think it's also very important to consider the effects that these are going to have on people. Yeah. Beyond just kind of a numbers game of how many people can we get off the streets and whatever else.
Yeah, the people part, right?
Yeah.
It's huge. All right. Lucas Moulton, how about yourself?
Yeah. So just a little bit about myself here. I'm in my final stretch now at university, finishing up my criminology degree, minor in psychology. So, I've done a lot of the crim work insofar, so a lot of my next semester is going to be a lot of electives. So I really was eager to take the chance to, and also the same as Sarah, this was more of an elective course for me. I already had finished all the core requirements, right? But the reason I was incentivized to take the course, I actually I've taken 2 courses already with Dan, and the most recent one was a kind of a general overlook of advanced issues in policing, studying marginalized communities and whatnot, right? And for about a week or so in that course, we did focus on homelessness, and it kind of scratched the surface probably about a little bit what we'll talk about today. And when I found out the course was offered, I kind of jumped at it because I think it would be a really good way to kind of finish off my degree and really challenge any maybe latent biases I had about homelessness kind of coming into it. And I think along with many other people, may have not realized that they developed some biases about how they approach homelessness and how it should be handled. Yeah.
Well, I mean, let's dig into that then. Yeah. What did coming into the course, thinking of yourself before the course to now, what do you think changed with you in your understanding around homelessness and I guess whether it's different government systems or attempts to lessen it, to solve it, to get rid of it, or just for how it's portrayed in the media? Like what changed? What has changed with you?
Yeah, specifically with me coming into it, I think I always thought homelessness should be a lot more individualistic, right? It was a lot more in these pathologies of, moral deficits in the person. And like, I think it just kind of happened. That's kind of how it would be broadcast in the media a lot. You'd hear a lot of it growing up.
You think it could be someone's fault, right?
Yeah.
Something that you
was
brought upon yourself.
Some moral
opposed to-
blame to it, either it's quality of laziness, drug addiction, what have you, right? And having that mindset kind of causes you to overlook these broader systemic factors that can be, incorporated into this, so these bigger moving parts, right? Like, a lack of affordable housing stock and whatnot.
That's a pretty big shift, right?
Yeah,
like
yeah.
that's a massive a shift based on listening and understanding.
Yeah.
How does that feel?
I don't know. I'd say it feels pretty liberating having a new stance on it, because that's really what I wanted to get out of the course, right? Have this new perspective, and it really, like I said, going through the course, it really has challenged these biases I didn't even know I had about homelessness and what are the bigger actors in it are.
Daniel Kudla, Professor Kudla, I don't know what success is for, I know for me what I consider success for my job to be, but as a professor, that has to be towards the top of success for when you have a student being like, I came in with one idea, and when I came out, because of listening, learning, understanding, and questioning myself, I've got a whole other viewpoint on things.
Yeah, and that's really the main intention of most sociology courses, really, is to have a different lens to look at the structures in society and how that shapes human behavior. And in the context of this course, as Luke just said, that's something I really strive to push in the course, is seeing homelessness not as an individual dysfunction, but rather a dysfunction of the system, structural challenges that have exacerbated homelessness over the last few decades, certainly, and even more so since the pandemic. So yeah, I'm happy to hear that lens, that changing lens, has been happening with some of my students.
And Luke, how old are you, by the way?
21.
Yeah, because I was much older than that before I started kind of learning the ins and outs of. I think it was mainly because of this job, to be honest. Eric or Sarah, what about yourselves?
Yeah. I think I found myself really coming from a very similar perspective as Luke, where especially regarding kind of the tent city for change and some of the kind of resident protesters and encamped there. Where it was so close to home, which I think is kind of really new for St. John's. I found myself kind of falling in with sort of this, it's called like a NIMBY, not in my backyard perspective, where, it was in Bannerman Park, so I would question, is this going to pose hazards to public safety? Are there going to be needles, whatever else, drug use, kind of, I guess, inappropriate public conduct. And I think, through this course, I've really been able to kind of gain a deeper understanding of the ways that homeless people interact with authority and with the shelter systems, and kind of some of the restrictions imposed by shelter systems and the ways that they're leveraged, as a means of social control, and to kind of displace homeless people from desirable spaces. And, I've really developed a deeper understanding of why someone would want to be encamped, at least over availing of temporary housing like a shelter.
Totally. Do you think you have more empathy now if you see an encampment?
Oh, definitely. Yeah.
And what do you think about having more empathy then for that, and what that means for you as whether it's your day to day, your voting choices, or just what you're going to learn from here on out?
Yeah, absolutely. I think I'm not so sure about day to day. I think I might certainly find myself more accepting and willing to kind of interact and socialize with people experiencing homelessness. As for politically, I think that's really a big piece is kind of that activism and kind of disseminating the realities for homeless people to a wider audience, the wider audience that oftentimes are the ones influencing policy decisions via their votes.
Right on. Sarah, what about yourself?
So I would say because of the amount of time that I've spent doing other crim courses and Dr. Kula can attest to this, I am usually a very vocal and very involved student in most of my classes. Mm-hmm. So I feel like a lot of these concepts have been touched on, and I have,
You came in with it. There's a base of knowledge that you came in with.
Yes,
sure.
I have absorbed a lot of that information, just sort of understanding on a base level that this is a structural issue, not necessarily an individual issue. So, I generally just had an open mind. But now after taking this course, I feel like I do understand now, as opposed to just being like, yeah, I get it. But like now I feel like I understand, like, where this comes from.
Yeah, what's an example of something that you feel you understand better through all of this?
So like for me, being able to take like some of the concepts that I already, utilize and recognize in my daily life, and applying them specifically to homelessness. Like for me, I really operate in my daily life and in other, and to other topics as well, that the language that you use is very important. And I feel like that's really applies to this course in particular because, when you start engaging, we talked about it in class, when you start engaging in this like sin talk and this sick talk, which is similar to what Luke said about just like pathologizing and creating it as this individual fault or this, this personal deficit, if you will. I like that phrase. That frames how society views homelessness.
So sin talk and sick talk. So like a conversation around, like you're framing it up that it's like a bad thing that people bring upon themselves individually. Is
Yeah.
that it? All right.
So in the course we actually talked about 3 different types there. We talked about sin talk, which is essentially it's your fault, it's this is because you do drugs or whatever, right? And then the sick talk is medicalizing homelessness.
Right.
So it's more so about you have some sort of mental illness or some sort of personal deficit that is resulting in the situation for you. But systems talk, which we feel is not addressed often enough, is more so about, looking at these structural issues that contribute to homelessness as opposed to it being down on a more personal level. There is more going on in the system out of our control.
So is this where that second part of the show, I used to talk about my show all the time, the course, for the title of the course, when we talk about social control, is that the systemic side of it, Professor?
Yeah, so going back to this discussion around sin talk, sick talk, systems talk, that's how I really ground the course early on, is discussing how commonly in society we have these general perspectives on what is the cause of homelessness and what its solution is. So like Sarah just said, sin talk is seeing it as a moral failing that needs punishment. Sick talk is seeing it as an individual pathology that needs treatment. The systems talk is about seeing it as a structural disadvantage that needs, societal change. So I start the course really hitting that point, and then we get into what the conventional responses are in contemporary society, like I said, such as policing, such as use of security, such as the use of hostile architecture, and increasingly, more compassionate approaches like homeless outreach workers, caseworkers, etc.
What is hostile architecture? I think I have an idea, but...
Yeah, the textbook definition would be like the installation of some sort of fixture or structure to render an object or street furniture unusable in a certain way.
Yeah, so you've seen pictures of the States. You have an overpass, and then under it, where there would be shelter, they'll put like those little triangular spiky things. So it's like, hey, if I want to sleep there, well, I can't. It's hostile to me to sleep rough there because you just can't sleep on that unless you're to build something over it.
That's exactly it. And the more conventional example that I use is just the extra kind of arm in the middle of a bench to prevent people from lying down, sleeping, and laying down in a park.
Yeah, of course.
Right? That's usually the common example. But the spikes under
That's
bridges.
such a small thing, but because I
curves,
didn't think about that one before, right? Yes, like that arm in the middle. You're like, well, no, you can't sleep here now.
Yeah, and there's increased attention towards examining these cases of hostile architecture and its effects in creating a democratic society, democratic city, when we are, quite literally excluding latently, informally, vulnerable populations that now can't use these particular spaces.
When you do a course like this, how do you bring in? So, like, I'm going to try to phrase this fairly simply, and so if I'm wrong, correct me. But so you've got the textbook, the academics are studying it, right? And then there's also the out in the world stuff that you bring in for like news or like how do you kind of marry all of this together for a course for instruction to make sure it is up to date, relevant, and then also touching on what is happening, like it could be globally, nationally, and then locally.
Yeah, and that's a really concerted effort I try to do in this course is provide and Eric mentioned some of these studies from San Francisco, the United States, and a lot of the studies are drawn from the U.S.
Well, and because there's a large housing homelessness issue, lots of discussion going on there, especially if like anyone following anything out of San Francisco in recent years.
Yeah, so there's a lot of cutting edge research as a result of that. And in order to balance the course out, I try to implement a little bit of local articles from the CBC, the Independent, and other news sources to contextualize these academic discussions into the local example. So, I mean, I'll give you an example of a couple years ago when I first started this course. I had to explain to students what a homeless encampment was because we never really faced that in St. John's. Yeah. Now, as of last October, we've seen them grow, and we've had tons of local experts, authorities talking about the local issue here. So I sprinkle in some of these local examples to contextualize these broader theoretical, qualitative research that I assign for students.
So for you folks then, on the student side of it, and there's what you study in the class, but are you also looking around and kind of bringing in your own, like whether it's like, okay, you go, and if it's an encampment in St. John's, just being aware of it, but do you also seek out, like, are you reading news or reading like local or national or global things around this topic?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you got to keep up with kind of your local examples, but in that too, you're not just reading news articles and stuff. You're also just, when you're walking downtown, you see different things and you have a different perspective on it, right? So I was downtown. Totally. I was downtown the other weekend, and they just recently, not too long ago, renovated the National War Memorial, and down there they have 2 security guards posted 24/7, right? And then you start to question, like with kind of narratives of the course, why that is. Why do we have security present there? What's their purpose, right? And as the course would likely argue, it's to regulate homelessness in those areas, right? Not
social control.
Social control, exactly. Not let people sleep on benches, not let people sleep on the grass. And it's, in a sense, too, because the city's paying for this contract with Garda World, right? It's, in a sense, it's to protect the city's investment in a way, prioritizing the aesthetic of this urban space rather than accommodating certain individual needs of homeless people, right?
Yeah, and I think some of the justification around that will also be like where it's a grave site. They will talk about not wanting that anything done with it, but then yes, the bigger discussion totally, right? Of just what are you doing? How is that space being policed, and why? And what's the justification, the balance around it? It's really interesting. Yeah. Any other examples from you two?
Yeah, I think through this course I've kind of developed. I won't say a cynical, but certainly a constructively critical lens to view, especially within our locality, kind of the goings on.
By the way, I like constructively critical. I'm going to steal that for my own life and use it. It's like, you're getting pretty cynical, Adam. No. I'm constructively critical.
So you'll see, during the summer with the pedestrian mall, a lot of the outdoor furniture even, I would argue, kind of contributes to more of a subtle form of hostile architecture. I'm not sure if you guys have seen the kind of the more upright picnic benches that have this kind of octagonal shape. I kind of question, why would they choose that over a conventional, long horizontal bench, which would have plenty of surface space, say, to lay on or to rest on.
Yeah, and I'm picturing the picnic table that everyone has seen for, I don't know when the picnic table was invented, but there's one that comes to mind, and it is the one you're talking, and then the ones downtown were very different. You're right.
Exactly. Yeah.
Well, that's really interesting because I've sat at those, but I didn't have that thought around it. So,
and I certainly wouldn't have before this course.
Before the course, right on.
Right.
What about you, Sarah?
So just kind of like bouncing off of what like Luke said there, it is sort of, you kind of have to, especially after this course for me anyway, it's like, when you see conversations around like, the local homelessness issue, it's like, once again, you can kind of see the way it's framed, the language that's used to describe it. And again, what Luke said there, it really works to kind of encourage this privatization of a public space because, again, it's, the public is the public. That includes everyone, doesn't it?
Yeah.
However, when we start to create these divides about where homeless people can and can't be, that does inevitably create some sort of discrepancy between a homeless person and a housed person.
Right.
Inherently.
All right, you're listening to The Signal. I'm Adam Walsh. Today it's a conversation. It's around a university a course called Homelessness and Social Control. We've got a professor here, 3 undergrad, and, well, a couple folks just graduating, but students here who just took the course. We're drilling into this course here today. For you, the listener, here's my question for you. What do you think we need to do to end homelessness, or at a minimum to improve things, to get things going in a better direction? You can text us 709-327-8206. Email us thesignal@cbc.ca. Whenever we do shows like this, there's a push towards looking for solutions, answers. Even if the solutions aren't easy, even if we don't know what they are yet, it's always an important part of the conversation. Doug Pawson is the executive director of End Homelessness St. John's. And End Homelessness just released, it's called St. John's Community Plan to End Homelessness 2024 to 2028, right? Because there's lots of work that's been going into figuring out how to improve things. He joins us now on the line. Hi, Doug.
Hi, Adam. How are you?
Good. I was looking through the report. How long did it take to get that thing together?
Oh, boy. That was months and months in the making. Lots of consultations and engagement, lots of dedicated time with lived experience, the Lived Experience Council to inform it. And it took a long time to get to the release a couple weeks ago.
So there's a couple things I'd like to pick through, and then what I'll do is as we talk, then I'll go back to the folks in studio after I let you go, and it will help kind of inform the rest of the conversation to take what's been studied in a course, to hear from yourself and some solutions, and also some of the framing up that you'll provide. But for folks listening, when we talk about homelessness in and around St. John's, like, what's the reality? What does that look like?
I mean, there's been a steady increase of homelessness in our community, in communities around the country over the last 4 years. We've seen dramatic changes in the rental housing market. The pre-pandemic vacancy rate in St. John's was 7.5%. Today it's hovering over 1%. So there's been a real uptick in people experiencing homelessness or at risk of, and there's just been lots of changes that have occurred. Public policy doesn't always match the speed of, the dynamic, labor market or dynamic housing market.
Yeah, for numbers, I mean, for St. John's, because this looks at St. John's, I think for chronic homelessness, it was getting close to 600, which would be like 588, I think, which would be the minimum there, and then add a few hundred more on as you slowly march towards 1,000 folks who would have experienced homelessness for one night over the course of a year, right?
Yeah, that's right, and we have high rates of chronic homelessness in St. John's, which for folks listening just means really extended periods of time experiencing homelessness over the course of 1 to 3 years. So that has traumatic impacts on people and their ability to sort of move beyond, either staying in an emergency shelter or sleeping rough and into housing. So it's quite a problem that we're trying to solve for here, for sure.
The goal here to get to a point where homelessness is rare, brief, and non-recurring. What are some of the ways to get there compared to where we are now?
Yeah, well, I mean, I'll take an opportunity just to kind of frame it in the context of the conversation around social control, right?
Yeah, sure.
Governments, the federal government, for example, got out of investing in housing in the 90s, right? And that led to, a deterioration of social housing, non-market rental housing, and it forced a reliance on the private rental market, across the country. So here we are 30 years later. We now have what we would term sort of a financialized housing market where homes are viewed more as a financial asset than it is, a place to live. And so we've conditioned ourselves, and governments have conditioned ourselves to view housing in such a way. And as a result, the folks who've been squeezed out of that market are the most vulnerable and continue to be the most vulnerable. So when we see increases of homelessness, it's really the result of public policy failures, right? So that's the form of social control where governments use their power to condition folks and everyday citizens to think of problems like homelessness, for example, or a housing crisis in certain ways When we talk about rare, brief, and non-recurring, what we're trying to really say is, homelessness may still happen, even if we have a perfectly functioning system of care. But when it does, we want it to be rare. It's less frequent and less occurring than in the past for somebody, for example. It's brief, right? So that you don't languish in shelter. You don't become chronically homeless, right? So you don't have to experience 6 months of the last 12 months or 18 months of the last 36 months of homelessness to sort of be chronically homeless. And then it's non-recurring in that when somebody finds a home, that they know where to go to get the supports before maybe having another emergency situation where they might rely on a shelter, for example. So it's taking that lens of just improving the system and making sure everybody is coordinating in our work and efforts together as a community to make sure that homelessness is rare, brief, and non-recurring.
Do you have progress markers for the future around this? What will progress look like with the report out? How do you define, hey, this is making a difference, we're heading in the right direction?
Yeah, great question. So in the community plan that we released, we kind of projected out, if the status quo continues, here's what we can expect in a few years. Yeah. And the numbers triple, right? The numbers are looking like, even where it is today, as high as it is today, we could see tripling if we don't work together. And when I say we, I mean community, of course, but also the three orders of government working together. And we have an ideal state where we can say if all of these governments are making those investments and we're starting to see housing online and we're prioritizing folks who've got those experiences of homelessness to get into housing, we can see dramatic reductions. We can see, a fourfold reduction in homelessness in our community down to maybe 100 people. And that what would that mean? It would mean, more people are finding housing, more people have supports. There's more prioritization for those folks to get into housing, and we can start to see real measurable progress towards that in the next few years.
Before I let you go, we did a show yesterday, and I was talking to some folks at food banks, right? And we were talking to, we heard a stat from Bridges to Hope, and I'm not going to confuse poverty with homelessness, but the stat was, November was in St. John's Bridges to Hope's most busy year ever. I think the number was something like 1,700 folks, 600 children, 200 seniors, something ballpark around that. When you hear that type of evidence on the food insecurity, poverty side of things, and then you look at what you're trying to do around make progress, what's it like pushing that rock up the hill of the Sisyphean task of trying to make this progress and for everything that is needed for Newfoundland and Labrador? Because we're only just talking St. John's. There's the whole rest of the province as well that has its own issues with housing and homelessness.
Oh, exactly. This is not a unique issue for St. John's. It's provincial. It's national and its issues. And you're right not to conflate poverty and homelessness together, but what it is a sign of is that there's deepening inequality, there's deepening levels of poverty happening. It's increasingly more difficult for folks who may have the social supports to get by normally, but who's now straining on those supports and not able to access things into the future that could lead to experiences of homelessness, poor health outcomes, and just, we got to recognize that these are problems that are, not isolated to one government department or one level of government to solve. It's going to require, all hands on deck to figure out how we resolve the income issues that people are facing, and how we're going to continue to drive affordability measures so that people don't feel like they're living on the margins all the time. That adds so much stress to folks and families and communities, and it leads to worse outcomes. And we continue to invest in emergency outcomes when we need to be investing in preventative efforts. We need to do both right up front. Yeah. But we need to have a concrete plan of how investments into emergency responses and preventative responses can lead to better outcomes, in the short and medium and long term.
Doug Pawson, as always, thank you very much. And this conversation will continue because I know we're trying to work out a plan to really dig into that report for a future show. So thanks so much.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Adam. Appreciate it.
All right, Doug Pawson, their Executive Director of End Homelessness St. John's. We were talking about the St. John's Community Plan to End Homelessness 2024 to 2028. Let me bring it to the guests here in studio. So as you listen to this, right, so this is the group that's trying to end homelessness, working with different community groups, government, listen to folks with lived experience, trying to push things forward. What stood out for you in this conversation?
Yeah, I would say really for me it was the kind of need to prioritize the experiences of homeless people individually. And I think that kind of, I find myself, of course, adopting a really similar perspective and have through the course that, a lot of the times, solutions to homelessness are evaluated along the metrics of, their financial costs. So, they're justified as being, this is going to, if we give homeless people houses, this is going to cost us less than if we're maintaining these emergency shelter beds for them. But I think there is, I think it's important to recognize that there is a humanity aspect to it that is, in its own right, justified. I think we do need to consider, regardless of the cost, the humanity of these people.
So that's Eric Mustad there. We've got Lucas Moulton and Sarah Rochford here, as well for students, and Professor Daniel Kudla here. Any other thoughts from?
Yeah, one of the big parts that stood out for me is this kind of incentive he brought up of needing complete collaboration between the different levels of government and nonprofits alike, right? Because what you have with homelessness for a very, very long time is this sense of bureaucratic shuffling where the responsibility of ending homelessness is just delegated to different, and they keep passing it on to one another.
Yeah,
right?
and ministers can change, files can change, departments can change, and then it depends on the level of government and the government of the day and everything.
Absolutely.
It's like, to me, it reminds me of waiting for the planets to align in a way for what gets discussed.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And what we've seen from that is it's just not effective, right? It doesn't effectively address homelessness to any capacity when we don't have any collaboration between the levels. Everybody, the different levels of government have different responsibilities, I'd say, between what they need to do to address it, right? Having the pretty much complete disinvestment in federal housing, social housing stock, right? That I would say that would be the responsibility of the federal government, but every actor has to do something, including us students kind of activating for it. Right? Yeah.
Sarah, what about yourself?
Actually, yeah, I agree fully with what Luke over there said. There is definitely a sense of collaboration that needs to come together to sort of, tackle this issue. And what I find interesting as well, specifically what Doug Pawson said about, people living on the margin. It's one of those things where it's, it's very easy to have precedences about homeless people and ideas about what that looks like. But at the end of the day, there are a lot of people that are living on the margin like that. And sometimes all it takes is one emergency or one, just one life event to now that could be you. Right? So I think that there does need to be some sort of change around how we view that. And sort of recognize that this term of homelessness is not always equivalent to visibility.
Yeah. To dip back to yesterday's show again, something came up in the conversation about, we talked about joy, right? And then if we're talking about, so yesterday was largely, a bunch of the conversation was about food insecurity and food banks. But then on the homeless and homelessness side of things, I just think about when you get into your bed and your head hits your pillow and that joy you feel, right? But then when you think of either from homelessness or on the poverty side of things, folks on the margins or folks who are running into massive housing difficulties, where's the joy in that in life? How do you get to joy and being somewhere that is safe and acceptable for you? Because that leads to a lot better things in life if you can actually experience some joy.
Yeah, I would say that this is similar to what we talked about in class, from my understanding of it anyway, of like the housing first policy, where it's more so focusing on, is it, because of these, is it because of issues like mental illness, drug use, and that kind of thing? Is that what causes homelessness, or is it the other way around? Is it because, so many people are living without stable living that kind of exacerbates those issues? And, basically just based on that, again, going back to sort of like these ideas about what homelessness is and what it looks like, it's very easy for people to be like, well, why don't you just get a job? Yeah. But it's one of those things where it's like, there is like it's kind of hard to do that when you don't have a house, you don't have a home address, you don't have somewhere to change, you don't have somewhere to get clean, all of those things that are typically needed for a job.
Yeah, totally. Speaking of Housing First, I read this really good article recently called Why the Housing First Approach Has Struggled to Fulfill Its Promise of Ending Homelessness. Luckily, the author is here with us in the studio, Professor Daniel Kudla. Tell us about this and relate it to the conversation we're having.
Yeah, so this is based off of a study I did with a colleague of mine from Australia, Andrew Clark, where we were interested in this emerging critical research on Housing First. Now, Housing First, simply put, is just the idea that housing should be a human right and people should be given supports.
Everyone should be able to have a home that is safe and adequate and appropriate.
Exactly. And this is usually in contrast with what's known as the staircase model, where people have to gradually graduate into the next step to avail and attain independent housing. So that basically flips it, saying give you housing first, then voluntary supports, as opposed to compelling people to go seek treatment to then graduate to getting independent living. So Housing First, as a philosophy, sees housing as a human right with voluntary supports.
Lots of folks talk about this, and there's lots of good things to be said about it that I've read. What are some of the – is it the framing? Is it the details? What are some of the issues around it?
Yeah, so what we find is it's not an issue with its core philosophy of housing as a human right, because I've gotten a couple angry emails from scholars across the country saying that this is a negative view of Housing First, which is not the case, but rather in the way it's implemented is where some of the dysfunctions fail. So
so you're saying like the sentiment, like I get the sentiment, sure, but it depends on, are we talking Denmark, Finland, Australia? Where are we looking for how this sentiment is actually put into policy, and what are the subpoints of the policy?
Yeah, exactly. And going back to what Doug said earlier about this idea of financialization of housing, so that's where a lot of the core issues happen with the implementation of Housing First. At least in the Canadian context, we heavily rely on implementing Housing First program within a housing stock that overly relies on the private rental market, which, as we all know, rents are increasing, it's unaffordable. Whereas, and to what you're pointing to here, in the case of Finland, for instance, which has been seen as a gold standard, and it was actually mentioned in the report by End Homelessness St. John's, is what we're seeing is a more concerted effort to implement Housing First at the government level to ensure there's enough social housing, affordable housing. They've converted homeless shelters into independent living, for instance, and they've reduced homelessness by 72%.
Yeah, no one's sleeping rough anymore, apparently, because we did an interview months ago on the show. But it was like to go from folks out, like encampment type sleeping rough, to pretty much no one.
Exactly. So in that case, the difference, in my view, is it's institutionalized at the government level, whereas in the Canadian, American, Australian context, it's seen as kind of these discrete patchwork of programs across the country, not really centralized, institutionalized at the state level.
So when you got those the emails, what's the discourse like back and forth? You're like, look, no, that's not what I meant. I'm not, criticizing the sentiment here, but it's just it's a detail thing, which you would think other professors would understand that, or are they just being people?
Some of the feedback was constructive insofar as people were suggesting that it could be used as ammunition to argue against Housing First, which was not my intention, but rather that there's a fault in its implementation, not its core philosophy. So I can understand that constructive criticism that some of the scholars had for me, but yeah, I mean, there's a lot of supporters of Housing First, myself included. But again, it's the devil's in the detail in terms of its implementation. And I think the Finnish model, albeit isn't an entire gold standard, it's an example of what can be done here in the Canadian context. But that requires commitment to social change at a larger level.
Yeah, and so often on we'll do shows, and we'll no matter what the issue, but it kind of comes down to what works somewhere. You look at it, and then you're like, how does that work for this province, town, city, province, country? Because places and cultures can be different depending on any number of reasons. So, I mean, is that also part of it for what you're saying as well?
Yeah, definitely. And I listened to that show where you had some of the Finnish scholars come and talk about this. There's certainly regional differences, differences in the political economy of a state, differences in terms of levels of government. So, yeah, there's not a singular solution, but it needs to be adapted, obviously. to a particular jurisdiction differently. And just something that stood out for me from what Doug said, which I totally agree, which is related to this notion of housing first, is, and coming back to this idea of social control, we have to date back to some of these failed and disinvestment in public policy from the late 90s.
Yeah.
And in particular, the pivotal act was the Canada Health and Social Transfer Act, which really changed the game in terms of expanding poverty, increasing visible homelessness, which has led to the fact that we now rely upon more punitive social control tactics that we've been discussing earlier on in the show, like security, like hostile architecture, to manage the problem of visible poverty as a result of these failed public policies or just the inability to form strong, coordinated public policies that Doug was talking about.
I'm interested in, there's another piece you wrote. It was a point of view piece back 2020.
Yep.
For us, CBC, at Newfoundland and Labrador. I'll bring it back to the students then, but I'm curious, I like asking folks to look back at certain things, right? So you wrote this piece, Homelessness, here's how the pedestrian mall in St. John's could be a catalyst for real change. The summer's experiment is an opportunity to work on a critical issue. I'll just read the first bit here, right? It says, so this is back, folks, when the St. John's first had that bringing back the pedestrian mall for the first time since 1969. It said the summer, the city of St. John's will transform part of downtown into a pedestrian mall. The plan is also a critical opportunity for another kind of change. The plan is to create a pedestrian-only walkway and allow businesses to add temporary extensions outside their storefronts. This will attract visitors to the downtown. And it says, when foot traffic increases during the trial, the uncomfortable realities of homelessness will become more apparent. In the years since, I mean, this is some of the feedback that you do hear, right? Especially this past summer. It's like you'll talk about folks who, whether it's homelessness or folks who, some of the panhandling that goes on, and there's a discussion there of maybe folks are homeless or not, but it's a poverty / and can be a homelessness discussion. What do you think about this piece 4 years later?
Yeah, I'd say it's more relevant now.
Yeah,
definitely. Given statistically speaking, as Doug mentioned, and even just through the eye test, people are seeing more people, like you said, panhandling. And my intention with the article is not to critique or disapprove of the pedestrian mall by any means.
No.
But rather, this was based off of some of my doctoral work that I finished at University of Guelph, where I was looking at a similar revitalization plan of a main street in London, Ontario, which was called Dundas Place. And there was these kind of implicit social control tactics to just mask and invisibilize homelessness in these spaces. And my argument is merely that a transformation or revitalization of a main street like this does bring about the visibility of homelessness, people's views of homelessness, and that we need to direct the conversation not through sin or sick talk like we talked about earlier, but rather talk about that systems talk that folks like Doug's organization and other nonprofits are engaged in.
Yeah, because as opposed to when it's invisible and no one's talking about it, when it's visible and you do talk about it, there's that catalyst for change, right? What about the rest of you when it comes to thinking about whether it's the pedestrian mall, which we've already talked about, right? The sin talk, sick talk, but other things are catalysts for change. Like, do you think after you're listening to Doug Paulson, you're taking this course, when you look at the media environment now, looking ahead, are you optimistic about change? Like, are there enough catalysts out there pushing this conversation forward to actually get to some resolutions, or will it come down to what Doug Pawson said earlier? Fast forward, it could be 3 times the numbers. Where do you think? Where are we with all this?
Yeah, I think you bring up a good point, and I really don't have a clear answer. But
exactly. We don't have a crystal ball.
Yeah, exactly. But I would say the visibility of it puts it in the general realm of discussion. So at least we're discussing the issue of it, right? It's not just completely going unheard. So I think back to the encampment across from the Confederation building, then being moved to Bannerman Park, and just how much publicity stuff like that would get. People actually went and would interview, and we'd hear voices of people who are unhoused, right? I think that visibility creates a platform where we can begin taking their input and then instruct our decisions from there. Whether that goes up the chain, I don't know. But I think it's really, really important to get those rudiment values and what homeless people need, what their necessities are.
All right, Eric, Sarah, final thoughts for you on this. This is the look forward as we wrap up the show, because I got a couple pieces of tape to play to end with, so go ahead.
Yeah, I would say, I'm cautiously optimistic. I think, lately as kind of social media expands and forms of new media expand, we're seeing kind of a fractalization of sources. and I'm sure there's more your wheelhouse, you'd know. But I think that does have some drawbacks, in that it has potential for misinformation and the like. But I think the fact that really anybody can go out there and create content and find an audience is really giving voices to these kind of voiceless people, these very marginalized people.
And Sarah, your thoughts?
Yeah, so I mean, I agree with Eric in terms of the it's difficult to be optimistic. However, the fact that even courses like this exist at MUN, the fact that, we are all here as well, more students taking this course and going out into the world with these different perspectives on this now, and, the fact that that is garnering so much more attention seems like it would seem impossible that nothing could change, if that makes any sense, because it's like, we're talking about this so much more, and there's so much more understanding around it that, for it to remain completely stagnated just seems impossible.
Professor Goodliffe, final thoughts for you for today?
Yeah, just a quick thought, and I'll echo what Sarah just said, is, the intention of this course, like I said, is to change people's lenses and views on homelessness. And whether people work in the homeless serving sector or not, I don't know. But at least the next time someone does walk by an encampment, sees a person panhandling, they again have that kind of different perspective. So I'm glad to have these 3 strong students and others in my class that are engaged in this class.
Folks, thanks for this discussion today. Thanks for coming in, and good luck with the last bits of the semester. And thanks again.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, everyone. We're winding down today. Everyone's like, well, Adam, there's 4 minutes left. Yes, there is. So here's the thing. Couple notes. Friday is our Make the Season Kind show at Bannerman Brewing. Fortunate Ones will be musical guests. It's going to be a hoot. I'm talking about Friday because tomorrow, Trivia Day, a day early. So tell your friends. It's important to tell your friends, all of the trivia heads out there, tomorrow is Trivia Day with John Gushu. On the Signal Line side of things, we've got some messages we're also going to play tomorrow. So if you sent us a message, we will play it on tomorrow's show. We love getting all the feedback and thoughts from the show.